And where does ROG, leftist, progressive, communist ideas come from? Does it go back down to a single individual?
No. It's actually a very deep, it's a very deep sort of cultural trope in American history. Let me walk through. Here's since you have some nice research on the screen, we can follow along with this. Leftism is the real American tradition. America is and always has been a leftist country. I know that this is very difficult for conservatives to accept. It is unfortunately true. So, for example, let's consider Barack Obama. We're going to trace Barack Obama's ideas and origins back. So, who was Barack Obama's mentor? Well, that's a little bit disputed.
We've hit a couple names.
Yes, but you might think of Bill Ayers.
Sure.
And I think that's a very legitimate connection. They were certainly close, arguably before it was said that they were close. I
would have thought about Frank Marshall Davis. That's
his probably his dad actually, who's also, they look like. If you basically take Frank Marshall Davis and Stanley N. Dunham's face and morph them together, it looks like Barack Obama. Mm-hmm. This is another thing. Let's go full birther for a moment. Can we go full birther?
Sure. Yeah.
Obviously, he was not born in Kenya. That's ridiculous. That would have never happened at this time. What I believe happened was that basically Stanley Dunham's Dunham is also a communist. His black communist pornographer friend knocks up his teenage daughter, and the response is, and this was kind of a normal thing for 1960, the response is, let's find an African exchange student who can pretend to be the real father. Because actually my black communist pornographer friend knocked up my daughter is not acceptable in any way, shape, or form in 1960. Is
that what you're saying happened?
That's, I'm pretty sure, what happened. And that explains it explains the complete lack of a relationship between Barack Obama Sr. and Stanley N. Dunham. It explains Barack Obama's relationship with the guy he calls Pop. Mm-hmm. It explains a zillion things. And it's actually kind of banal. What's actually not banal is that I think they got communists working in the state government in Hawaii to kind of forge the documentation a little bit, which is why you had that whole foo-for-all with the birth certificate, which, by the way, we still have not seen.
My graphic designer in my company, I was in Woodland Hills, California. You know Woodland Hills, California. Mm-hmm. You may know Woodland Hills. Die-hard Obama guy.
Yeah.
Armenian guy, grew up in Venezuela, liberal family, so he's a supporter of it. Remember the day the White House dropped the birth certificate on their website?
Mm-hmm. I do.
He calls me. He says, "Can you come into my office?" I said, "What's up?" He says, "This is not a." He says, "This is not a birth certificate." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Pat, let me show you." He gets on there. He says, "This is all layered."
Yeah.
So he himself, who's a pro-Obama guy,
they left the layers in the file.
They left the layers
in the file, right? And the thing is, actually, Barack Obama is perfectly eligible to be president under this theory, right? He was born to two American parents, Stanley N. Dunham and Frank Marshall Davis. He was born, absolutely no question, in America, probably in Seattle. And then they basically went through this ridiculous foo-for-all to get a black exchange student to pretend to be his father.
Instead, it was a what? It was a porn.
It was Frank Marshall Davis.
Frank Marshall Davis is Barack Obama's father.
Yeah.
Your opinion.
That's my opinion.
Who else has that position?
You'll see. It's out there on the internet. It's Dreams from My Real Father, I think, there's a video on it. It's funny because Obama was visiting when he was president. He was visiting a genomics company in California that I knew the founder of, and I was like, "Get a glass, get a drinking glass." Get a glass, and we'll find this out. Because he doesn't look anything like Barack Obama Sr. Pull up a picture of Barack Obama Sr.
Nothing.
Nothing like him.
Nothing
like him, right? And they're black. That's clearly nothing like him, right? And so, this is nobody thought at the time this boy is going to grow up to be president. People are just like, the word bastard still had an impact then. And nobody wanted this kid to grow up with the real story of how this happened. And so they came up with this bullshit, right? And like, that's a sort of, it's a thing like the Stanley Levison thing where you're just like, you could call it a conspiracy theory, but it's actually a pretty banal thing to do at that time. It's actually pretty normal. It would be very weird now. Nobody would do anything like that.
Let's go back to it. So what did the original left?
So, okay, we're going back from Barack Obama. You go back to Bill Ayers. Now, Bill Ayers was the head of what organization?
Which one?
The Weather Underground, right? The Weathermen,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Right. So, very glamorous, you saw this, maybe you saw the awful, that awful Paul Thomas Anderson film, One Battle After Another, Yeah, don't.
I got a lot of movies to watch.
You don't want to watch.
I got to watch. I definitely have to watch John Reed, the Red movie with.
Reds, absolutely.
Yeah.
No. Oh my God, this movie is it's like this Antifa glorification movie with Leonardo DiCaprio. It's like, I wrote a review of it for The Spectator that was like, this may be the worst movie ever made.
Which one is this? The latest movie that just came out?
Yeah.
Oh, you can't even watch it for the first. It's all about illegal immigration or something. Is that the one you were talking about?
Oh my God.
Oh, it's called one of his worst movies of all time.
It is.
Vinny said he watched it, Rob, the other day. For the first 3 minutes, he shut it down.
It may be one of the worst movies of all time.
Really?
It is artistically bad. It is dramatically bad. It is aesthetically bad. And it is morally very bad.
It's got Sean Penn in it. It's got Benicio del Toro.
Oh, yeah. No, the acting is amazing. I mean, with some exceptions. But no, so, all right, so you go back to the Weathermen. The Weathermen are glamorous. You hear about them, you're like Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn. Like, Bernadine Dorn is hot, right? They're like, these are princelings. These are, and in fact, you know who Bill Ayers' father was? Thomas Ayers, and he was the CEO of Consolidated Edison.
Okay.
So this is a rich kid. This is like a, major league rich kid. But let's go back to the Weathermen. So the Weathermen are a splinter faction of a group called Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, which you've probably heard of. Let's go.
I've heard of Students for a Democratic Society.
Okay. Now, SDS is actually the youth wing of an organization which we're going to get successively cooler names here. We're going to get are you ready for some cooler names? So the SDS is originally the youth wing of something called the League for Industrial Democracy.
Nice. Capitalism and socialism.
League for Industrial Democracy.
Great name.
Very cool name. Could be a band, Could be a band. League for Industrial Democracy.
LID.
And it's basically changes its name from something called the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, which you'll see up there. And if you click on the Intercollegiate Socialist Society.
Now we're in 1905.
Now we're in 1905. No Moscow.
Yep.
Tsar is still on his throne.
Yep.
The Tsar is still on his throne. Now, if you look at the founders of the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, you'll see some names that you might recognize, like Upton Sinclair or Jack London. You've probably heard of Jack London. Right, this is like really deep in the mainstream. This is not, here, found Upton Sinclair, Walter Lippmann, Clarence Darrow, Jack London. You've heard of all these people, right? These are significant Americans, and this is not coming from the KGB. Okay, so actually, these are patrician. These are top tier Americans, right? So one of the things I discovered while looking at this is that you can go even farther back with this, because one of the founders of the ISS is a guy named Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Now, this is not a name you're going to know. Higginson is chiefly known as the guy who discovered Emily Dickinson. That's his chief claim to fame. It's a worthy claim to fame. But he's also, when the ISS is founded, he's like the old guy in the room. You'll go to these young revolutionary things. I'm becoming the old guy in the room, right? All these kids, right? And like, my audience base is heavily under 30, right? So you'll, because those are the radicals, right? Always. So, but there's always like an old guy in the room. So the old guy in the room, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, what's interesting is that he was part of an earlier era when he was young. He was part of an earlier era of American radicalism. He was, in fact, a financier of terrorism. He was actually one of the supporters of the leading American terrorist of the period, and he was a member of a group. I don't know if they called themselves this, but they became called that. Brace yourself for a serious comic book name, The Secret Six.
The Secret Six.
The Secret Six.
All right.
You know, you're like, is this a real thing? Is this a real thing?
Who's the Secret Six?
Who were the Secret Six?
1859.
They were the equivalent of, like, basically wealthy Saudis who funded Osama.
What?
John Brown. You've heard of John Brown.
Of course. John Brown,
John
yes.
Brown.
But not the other names that I'm looking at there.
Yeah, but, like, you know, let's see who
He
are the...
looks like an evil guy. Look
He
at
was
that.
a psycho.
Holy
he was a
moly.
complete and total psycho. And so, you know what one of the names of the leading Antifa organizations is? The John Brown Gun Club. So we're really dealing with something you cannot find any living conservative tradition in America with this kind of lineage.
But if you go back, if I read that, go back to it, Rob, what you just said, it doesn't sound... So an evangelical Christian of a strong religious conviction, Brown was profoundly influenced by the Puritan faith of his upbringing. He believed that he was an instrument of God, raised to strike the death blow to slavery in the U.S. That doesn't sound like a bad person. A sacred obligation. Brown was leading the exponent of violence in the American abolitionist movement, believing it was necessary to end slavery after decades of peaceful efforts.
So he was previously known for what's called the Potawatomi Massacre, where he was in Kansas, where a lot of this trouble was happening, and he just basically, you know, like drags people out of their house with swords and murders them. Not that Harper's Ferry was exactly a success either. And so, you know, he's basically, if you look at the abolitionists in the run-up to the Civil War, they look very, very modern. So if you're looking at the Republicans in the world of Abraham Lincoln, there are actually two very different sort of directions that come together in the Republican Party. There are the abolitionists and the anti-slavery men. And this sounds like you're describing the same thing, right? In fact, it's totally different. This is why the Emancipation Proclamation, for example, comes so late in the war, and it has to pretend to be a military measure. Because actually, if you went into a bar in Richmond in 1861, and someone asked you to explain the war, and you said, this war is a holy crusade by the abolitionist North to abolish slavery in the South, they would clap you on the back and buy you another beer. If you said that in Chicago, they'd kick your ass, right? So the anti-slavery men, the first Republican presidential candidate is John C. Fremont, which a lot of, you know, who also conquered California, so a lot of stuff is named for him. There's a town of Fremont near where I live. Fremont's slogan was free men, free soil, Fremont. So if you were a free soiler in the West...
Free man, free soil, Fremont.
Yes, very, very catchy. So what free soil meant was that basically slaves should not be allowed in the territories that were not incorporated as states. And you're like, well, you know, you're against slavery. We're all against slavery, right? You know, actually, the free soil men had a very specific point. They didn't like slavery because they didn't like black people. They were actually, and the abolitionist movement had many tropes of sort of a modern perspective on race, but the anti-slavery men were hardcore racists. So, for example, Oregon, you might not know this, Oregon, until I believe the 1970s, it was obviously a dead letter, prohibited black people from entering the state of Oregon.
1970, just 50-some years ago.
Yeah. In the 1970s, I forget when it was actually taken out of the Constitution. Oregon was never, obviously never a Confederate state. There was never any Confederate Oregon.
Yeah, you're right.
Banned
black people from entering the state were part of history long before.
Related racist language in the state. I'm a little wrong on the dates. Related racist language in the state constitution remained until 2002, right? So, and this is because of basically the anti-slavery man heritage. The Western Republicans were anti-slavery. the chic people in Boston were abolitionists. And they managed to form this coalition, which was the Coalition of Lincoln. But if you look at the way Puritans and abolitionists thought, very, very, very similar to liberals today. Very similar kind of mindset, similar kind of messianic, and they had all kinds of causes. Abolitionism was just one of them. Prohibition was another huge cause of these same people, right? And so you kind of recognize when you learn to basically, think about Harvard for a moment. In a way, Harvard has been the leading institution in American intellectual life for literally almost 400 years. It was founded in 1636. If you look at basically what are the ideas of Harvard at date D, you are going to find them running America at date D plus 10 years, D plus 50 years, D plus 100 years, right? And so Harvard was founded as a Puritan institution. Obviously, it was a Puritan college for ministers. Actually, I learned this. I did a debate at Harvard about 6 months ago with a professor there, and for this, I boned up on the history, and I discovered that Harvard is actually somewhat implicated in the Salem witch craze.
What did they say when you brought that up?
They didn't know anything about it. She didn't know anything about it. But so you have this sort of Puritan religion of Harvard that basically you can watch sort of morph over time from like Puritanism into like pure hippieism. And there's never a break in that. There's never no foreign army ever comes and takes over Harvard. It's always sort of this process of a kind of internal becoming, really. And you can see how Puritanism in the 17th century becomes basically American progressive communism in the 20th and even 21st centuries. And so to understand history in this way as a conservative, you're just like, wait a second, America for its entire life has been on the left side of the political spectrum. So, for example, America is founded by these Puritan settlers, and the Puritans are, of course, Calvinists. And you can find, actually, in a way, the first woke regime in history was actually the strange regime of Edward the Seventh. The sixth or the seventh, maybe the sixth. I think the sixth, who is basically this boy king who comes after Henry VIII and before Bloody Mary. No, Edward the Sixth, sorry. Real brain fart. So basically, Henry VIII has this, of course, religious revolution where he breaks with Rome for various personal and political reasons. But he's not quite part of the extreme left wing, and I think you can really use this term at this time, kind of Protestant thing that's going on in Europe. But of course, he's influenced by this sort of whole Gutenberg revolution in thinking. And after he dies, his son, who is sickly and young, is basically tutored by these radical Protestants who basically create this kind of proto-Puritan regime in England that lasts only for a few years because Edward VI dies young and is replaced by Mary Tudor, who tries to return the country to Catholicism. She also died somewhat prematurely, and then you have the Elizabethan world. Point is, you can connect basically in this sort of continuous ideological and cultural thread. You can go all the way back to 16th century England from Barack Obama. You can connect the abolitionists to the Puritans. You can connect the Puritans to the Tudors. Hi there, I'm Curtis Yarvin, aka Mencius Moldbug, and I've created a profile on this fascinating site, Monect, which allows anyone to put in a few dimes and ask me about anything, and I'll take questions on anything that isn't personal. I have many opinions on history, politics, science, economics, and all kinds of interesting things. And if you have a good and interesting question, why not ask it? I might well answer it. Thank you very much.